Okay, we are missing one of our panelists. Was there? He was in the other room, but must have gotten lost. I suggest we start. We have a big topic and not that much time, so I don't think we should delay this further. So let me just give a few words of introduction to this topic. I see we have a full room, and we have a great panel, and I suppose there is a reason why we have a full room. Is that trade and trade policy and trade wars is unfortunately again a term that has been every day in our screens and in our newspapers. And I think we are really, we say that almost every year on every topic. We are at the crossroads. But I think this time, the prediction that we are at the crossroads about the trading system is really coming true. Again, as I said, the news every day about some of the big players, China and the US obviously, but others, is not very good. And I think we should be worried about the system. We should be worried also about some of the macroeconomic implication of what's going on. So it's not just what is going to happen in some month at the end of the year about the WTO and the appellate body. It's also about what's happening right now in trade and the implications of that for the global economy and for the global trading system. So the way we are going to do this panel is as follows. I've asked each of the panelists to speak just for 5 minutes to start with, to give his or her point. What do they think is really the essential issue here? And then we will have a bit of a conversation among the panel members, and then obviously there will be plenty of time for the room to react, to come in, to pose questions. So I'm going to start with you, Alicia. You and I, we wrote this memo to the incoming trade commissioner that was already addressed in the previous session. But where should Europe trade policy go in your view? And it's not where it should go in 5 years from now. Where should it go right from the start, as the new commissioner is taking on a very hot seat? And with no time sort of to look at what is the situation and to make up her or his mind about where to go, one way is to plunge immediately. So what would you tell the commissioner? What should be a priority for EU trade policy? And that in 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to be quick, first of all, because you can actually read the memo and the conclusions. And I can't deviate much because my co-author is sitting right behind, so so I really can't. But I will in Q&A, if you allow me. So basically there, what we say is, do what you've always tried to do, push for the WTO to survive. We don't say that, but I would say that Robin Hood, meaning, just do it, just save the world in its multilateralism, and that's all fine. But at the end of the day, we need more allies. I mean, we can't do that alone. For that matter, we already have our single market. I mean, so we need to forge, which we do say there, alliances. We need to kind of indicate to the US and of course to China, which also wants to reform the WTO, we just don't happen to agree in the way we would both reform the WTO. So I guess we need to forge alliances of what we say very, very clearly in our memo, like-minded alliances. Yeah. So think about Australia, Canada, the usual suspects, and try to basically push it from there. Now, there's two ways to do it: within the WTO, or without the WTO. Imagine that by December, the WTO is no longer functioning, or at least not its appellate body, and we need to start thinking of other ways to do it. So in the memo, we kind of cover the two possibilities. In the case in which we wouldn't have a WTO to push with, we would have to replicate basically the institutions we have now, or the institutions or the ways of working for that multilateral trading system which we have now. Think about a different type of appellate body outside of the WTO. All of that, I think, are things that the new commissioner has to really start working on, because we are very close to that crossroads as to whether we can do it with the WTO or, unfortunately, without the WTO. Then we look at bilateral agreements. So, of course, not at the speed of light, I must say, based on the Mercosur, but certainly better than nothing, meaning we have indeed achieved a number of free trade agreements with the commissioner with the commission that is now ended. But certainly for the new commissioner, there is no time to waste. I mean, it has to be much faster. And this is simply because that first option, the multilateral trading system, might not be there, no matter whether we can find some like-minded alliances. These alliances may not be strong enough or relevant enough, given that we're not thinking of the US and China at the very beginning of that alliances. And finally, I think we all realize that we're increasingly trading less goods. You just have to look at the data. I mean, it is basically trading volume is at zero growth now, and it's not only because of the tariffs. So we have to think about services, e-commerce, investment as a very, very important tool, and climate change. So anything we do will have to be more comprehensive in terms of free trade agreements, be it under the WTO, without the WTO, or bilaterally, than it has ever been. So I can't think of anybody taking that job, or probably there will be candidates, but my point is it will be harder than ever. So that's my 5 minutes, I guess.
Great, thanks, Alicia. So let me now move to Yi. Chinese, but not a Chinese official, a Chinese academic based in Geneva.
Next to WTO.
Exactly, in the city of multilateralism.
Yes.
So, Yi, what is your view on this matter, where we are at this crossroads?
Okay, follow up the question and discussion with Alicia by emails. Thank you very much to invite me here. I will try to provide two evidence based on my ongoing research, summary research related to trade, conflict, and e-commerce. And at the end, I would like to provide some policy implication, because I saw some my former colleagues, former boss here, so I will provide some suggestion to looking forward. What can we do? Number one, trade conflict. What's the effect between China-US trade conflict? I will not mention about war, because based on our research, it haven't done yet in terms of trade conflict. Result as following. Number one, if you look at short-term response, look at US capital market, China capital market. So store return compared to after US-China trade conflicts, so store return decline, default risk increase, bond return decline. People will ask why? What's linkage by only trade, China-US trade conflict by announcement? What's channels? Let's think deeper as we taught in class. Number one, direct exposure between US-China linkage. You export-import directive for final goods, number one. Number two, look at intermediate goods. US import Chinese intermediate goods for the final goods for Apple's finally produced apparatus. Number two. More importantly, I have to repeat 3 times. More importantly, we live in a globalization 2.0, so-called global value chain. You look at one factory who never have any direct exposure with China, US, but your supplier of a supplier, your customer, if we study very carefully through input-output linkage, through the network, through the customer, supplier. The third, more important, US-China linkage through is the indirect exposure. Follow global value chain, which innovated by my colleagues in Geneva, Richard Bowen and his colleagues. Okay? It's very important. If you're interested, look at the papers, you can download from my website. It's number one in terms of US-China direct trade conflicts through the US capital market. Because second more important is uncertainties. Uncertainties between US-China, two biggest economy, will spread over to the real economy, from delay to investment, worker delay to consumers. In the end, uncertainty can change the real investment in long terms. Thirdly, as a very important relation with the trade relation with Europe, so-called spillovers. If China have a problem with US, a lot of neighbor country got benefit in paper. If you look at Vietnam, Cambodia, yes, short-term, a lot of multinational companies move to this low-wage area. But more importantly, for trade, or benefit from trade, not only the number for export, more importantly, it's efficiency, skilled workers. A lot of factor matters. That's why, in the end, we can look at how to reshape global value chain. EU area will never escape from these kind of connections. That's why I say, let's look at looking forward. Next step, how can we eliminate the cost of trade liberalizations, trade integrations, how to learn and benefit more in the future in terms of trade integrations, which I will talk about second part of my research about e-commerce. Do I have 1 minute?
Yes, you do.
Okay, follow up on my research use with the biggest e-commerce company in China, every single transaction data from Alibaba Group. We try to understand what's the benefit, what's new about e-commerce. Number one, daily trading volume for e-commerce in China, on average, in this past 2 years, $5 trillion in the volumes. Annual growth rate, more than 10%. If you look at online consumer spendings, more than 2 trillion RMB. I'll give you one example. In China, we also have a so-called Black Friday. 1 day trading volume, $350 billion in November 11th by last year's numbers. Okay? What's benefited for e-commerce? Number one, the reduced surging costs, online, offline. Secondly, reduced price. More importantly, for economics, for macroeconomics, we will look very closely about income equality, consumption equalities, how to make poor people, old people, different heterogeneity across regions, rural area. How can they consume different kind of products like we had in Brussels, in London, in Geneva? Number two, benefits are huge. How to promote there? The two very important phenomena to promote e-commerce, which I think is very important for EU in the future to collaborate with China, collaborate with the emerging market. Number one, finance. Consumer financing is very important. Now fintech company, big tech company like Alibaba, like Tencent, like Amazon, they provide credit to online consumers. Based on my recent work with the BIS Yongxin and his team, we look at a big tech company, provide credit, promote consumptions, it's number one. Number two, technology. Once technology in China, for example, 4G, 5G, once a village, a mountain access internet, they can trade, they can do export, they can sell the stuff to rural area, remote area, from Tibet to Shanghai, cheaply. Then finally, very important for a lot of people from business environment, how to understand so-called new retailers. Because people always say online e-commerce is going to clouding out offline, like real shops. Because if I follow my research, we found that it's opposite. Because information transformations, they give people more direct information to combine two things together. If I have time, I can talk more. But in the end, trade, consumptions, and promotions between China and US. One thing missing here is global international financial systems, international currency. I will leave this discussion, this part to discussion part, Q&A part. Thank you.
Very good. So just one word. I mean, if we still have a WTO in a few months from now, certainly the e-commerce issue, which is already high on the agenda, will be obviously even bigger on the not just bilateral but on the multilateral agenda. So Kate, I'm turning to you. You are the representative here in town from USTR. There's been a lot of activity since you have been here. I think you were last year in the panel that we had on trade. So in 1 year, many things have happened. Many things had happened already the year before, but many more things have happened, both in the bilateral relationship, obviously, and in the multilateral agenda, where the US has been obviously a big actor. So, what is your point that you want to bring to this panel, and that relates, in a sense, to EU trade policy, from a US perspective?
Yeah, exactly. I'm happy in a Q&A to talk a bit about some of the U.S. trade policy directions, and I'm sure there are many questions, as I often receive them in lots of fora. But what I'd like to focus on is picking up a bit on what Alicia mentioned in terms of like-minded allies, because I recognize and I hear a great deal of rhetoric which paints the United States on one side of the agenda and the EU on another, and directly conflicting with one another. That rhetoric, frankly, is in many of the papers that you drafted for the incoming commission, and I think it doesn't really reflect the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground, as far as I see it, is that the United States and the European Union continue to share a great deal of views, whether it has to do with reform of the multilateral trading system, whether it has to do with how we address non-market economies and their role and impact on that multilateral trading system, and how we work together in a lot of areas in the world. And I want to talk just a bit about what we saw in Europe over the past couple of years under the leadership, frankly, of the European Parliament and Chairman Lange, and it was quite an interesting move on a number of the areas that we've focused on. And what I would like to see, if I had advice for the new commissioner, it would be to continue that work. And what we saw, of course, led again by the Parliament, was a number of initiatives to address the non-market economy in Europe, and a bolstering of the European trade defense in terms of trade defense modernization, a reform of anti-dumping methodology, an investment screening procedure extended throughout Europe, which reflects a shared view on how we address dumping, on how we address the impacts of excess capacity, how we address impacts of aggressive and erroneous investment in our economies. And this is work that we share. We work behind the scenes. We work with Japan in the trilateral context, and we want to continue that work. We also saw, of course, the Juncker Commission in March issue a very wide-sweeping communication, which for the first time described China as a strategic rival. This is very much in line with the U.S. position, which I should say also hasn't changed much over the last several administrations in terms of our concerns vis-a-vis China and the WTO. Our tactics certainly have changed, have become a bit more heightened, but it builds on years and years of consistent and troubling analysis regarding our partner in the East. Finally, I would mention that the premise, perhaps, that I disagree with most in your paper is the one that paints the EU as a victim in this greater Sino-US battle. I fundamentally reject that. The European Union and its member states are among the most important and significant economies in the world. European businesses have interests that are very similar to those of the American companies in terms of economic longevity and survival. And I think the EU and the new Commission team needs to address this question head on, not only as a bystander in a US-China trade war, but as an active participant in how we address these issues.
Great. That was very clear. Now, Bernd, let me turn to you. You have been re-elected as the chair of the INTA committee. The committee met yesterday and the day before. So obviously it's going to have the hearing with the new commissioner. So what is in your view, what is the position of not only just the committee, but the European Parliament as far as the EU trade policy for the next 5 years? What would you see as the priorities?
Yes, thanks a lot. And of course, I read your memo very carefully, and the three recommendations on page 183, the multilateral and WTO, the question of bilateral relations, and put services on the table. Yes, I agree, no doubt about. To stabilize the ruling of law instead of the rule of the jungle. And indeed, we have some differences in accepting the rule of law. We have a lot of cases, the Boeing Airbus case, the Spanish Olives, the steel tariffs, and so on. which are, in our view, not in line with the rule of law of international trade law. But this we can discuss. But in addition to your memo, I think we should reflect 3 further elements. Because I think your memo is really written from the hill of trade experts. Sometimes the people on the ground have a different perspective. They ask me, who is benefiting from trade? They ask me, what brings trade to my job? Is there job loss with trade? And they ask me, what is the contribution of trade to the Paris Climate Agreement and to the fight against climate change? So the perspective is quite different. And I think if we would not lose the support of the electors, the people, then we have to give an answer to this question as well. So I would really add 3 further points. First point is sustainability. Yes, we have to make clear that trade is in line with the SDGs, in line with universal labor laws, universal environmental standards. And this is not an easy task. So we have to reflect how we can introduce core labor standards in trade agreements, perhaps also make a link between WTO and sustainability to the SDGs, so that we make clear, yes, trade has an impact on the well-being of people here in Europe and also in the partner countries. Secondly, implementation and enforcement. At the moment, I think we can't change the government in the United States or the government in China. They have their own strategy. But we should really look on the effect on our existing possibilities. So implementation of trade agreements. Sometimes we have a use rate for small and medium-sized enterprises from 40% of trade preferences. That's not enough. The question of rules of origin are so complicated that normal people are not really able to understand the system. So the implementation of the possibilities specifically for small and medium-sized enterprises has to be improved dramatically so that there is a clear message: you and your jobs can benefit from trade. And also the enforcement procedure. So we have a lot of agreements and lot of common understanding with holy words, but in practice the situation looks quite different. We have sometimes difference with China on the custom code. We have practical questions with other countries. We have now the situation with South Korea, where South Korea is not implementing 3 core labor, ILO core labor standards for 7 years, and now we have the first time the enforcement procedure. So enforcement, by the way, the trade defense instruments are belonging also to enforcement of trade policy, and I'm really proud that we could modernize our TDI system and also could create this alternative calculation method. And at the moment, nobody made a case in Geneva against this new methodology. And this is a big success of the European trade policy, by the way, also from the European Parliament. And third point, coherence of trade policy with other policies. We have a big transformation in automotive sector now because of the digitalization, because of switch to e-mobility, and also because of competition and some measures here on the table. So we need a transition fund. We need really look how to react on that. We have to eliminate some trade barriers, and we have to be consistent also in our policy. Yes, modernization of WTO, no doubt about it. You spoke on e-commerce, 80 countries are with us. But the only element where all partners on the table are negotiated at the moment are the subsidies for fishery. and the capacity for fishery. And to be honest, it is not really serious. On the one hand, we want to cut the subsidies and eliminate new capacity for fishing. And in our European fishery policy, we make now the door open for new capacity. That's not the way we should deal with. So coherence is a third necessary element.
Thank you, Bernd. Now I see in the room many faces of people who are not trade experts. They are macro people. And I understand very much why there are here people, not just the trade experts who are, interested in anti-dumping or the tariffs or, what's going on in the global value chains. But from a macroeconomic perspective, are very worried of what is going on. And therefore, it's great to have a macro person with us on the panel. Reza, what do you make out of this from a financial perspective, from a macro perspective? What is your take on what's going on here?
Thank you, Andre. Very good to be here with seeing a lot of old friends and colleagues. As you said, I feel something of an imposter on this panel, given the depth of expertise on trade, which I simply cannot match. But what you said, I think, is very important. First of all, I thought maybe I give a brief overview of the financial market impact and then go into some of the economics, time permitting. I think from a market's point of view, there have been really three phases to the perception of the trade disputes. The first phase, I would say, the first half of 2018. And I would characterize that as mild concern in the markets. Mild concern because there were initial statements by the US administration and China in terms of trade tariffs, small imposition of tariffs, but against the background where the global economy, particularly the US economy, was very strong. So concern was mild. Then there is a second phase between the middle of 2018 and the middle of this year, where the concern was heightened because there were a greater number of measures, much larger measures, much larger proportion of global trade being subject to tariffs, but also a period where the global economy was slowing down. But the concern was heightened, but there was a sense of optimism. And the sense of optimism was there because of a perception in the markets that the two main protagonists in this issue were talking, and they were giving positive signals of potential progress. Now, we have now entered the third phase from about May this year, where there is alarm, if you wish, in the markets. I give you one example. If you look at the US stock market in the month of August, you have incredibly sharp movements. You have 3 episodes where the stock market falls by and rises by about 5%. Very, very unusual. And not all of those episodes, but generally speaking, the majority of those episodes were on the basis of announcements on tariffs, particularly the latest announcements by the US, and the signal that the markets are taking that, one, this process is going to take longer than expected to sort out, and that now the tariffs have risen to such an extent that it is likely to affect the profitability of the corporate sector across the world. So we are in that phase right now. Now, what about the macro implications? I think clearly, number one, as he mentioned, is uncertainty. And you see that in the stock markets. But I think relevant from a policy point of view, It is the fact that there is a very, very strong flight to safe assets. Assets which are traditionally perceived as safe. You see that on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of long-term bonds, government bonds. You do actually see that in the corporate sector, corporate investment grade bonds also, and you see that in currencies across the world. So that's number one. And it has policy implications, and I will come back to that in terms of policy implications. 1 minute. Okay, then I will not be able to tell you about the policy implications. I'll just set the scene for later.
Yeah, that's right.
Number two, investment. And we are at historic low interest rates, negative interest rates even faced by some corporates, but we do not see investment. Remember, after the US tax cuts, after some of the other measures across the world, there was great hope of investment coming back in a strong way, particularly in the technology sector. Simply, the data does not show that. Number three, exchange rates. Again, relevant for policy. Economic theory tells you if you impose tariffs and you're generally the perception of assets do not change in the capital account, exchange rate moves to rebalance trade. And that's precisely what you have seen. There are other factors, I admit, precisely what you have seen in terms of the dollar and what you have seen in terms of the yuan. Final point, I'll set the scene for discussion of policies later, what Europe, what US, what China should do. Final point, inflation. Now, traditionally, tariffs have been associated with higher inflation. We don't see that across the world, in fact, quite the reverse. But, just one factoid before I stop. If you look at the detailed US data and look at, split up the CPI between those goods that are subject to tariff and those who are not, you see that CPI for the tariffed goods are much, much higher. In fact, for the rest of the goods, it's negative, and therefore you see that the CPI has not increased that much. But there is a question for policy. Do you see through that? What's the implication for you? But maybe later on, I come back to how each region needs to respond in terms of macro policies.
Very good. So I think that was very useful to hear, in a sense, for the trade people, because trade people, trade negotiators, trade people, they are more micro people, they're more sectoral. They're used to think, this product, the impact and the distribution element. They're not used to think, and in a sense, luckily, they're not used to think that trade actions are going to have macro implications, right? Even if you do something on steel and stuff, it still remain very, very, very small. It may have an impact on the steel sector and maybe a bit on the steel users, but that doesn't yet reach macroeconomic implications. I think, in a sense, this time is different. Again, the backdrop is also one of fragilities in general, but certainly I think one hears it from all of the observers, from the IMF, from everywhere, that when you are looking at the downside risks, trade is always one or two or maximum three downside risks to the global economy that are put forward. So I think it's very useful to have not just a trade, a more sectoral perspective, but also a macroeconomic perspective. And as I said at the start, I think that is also part of this crossroad situation, because that has implication. Where's the global system going? And is it really a change? We have had a period, a very prosperous period. Certainly, China that entered the W in 2001 was a major change. There is no doubt. And now we are nearly 20 years later. And indeed, one needs to reassess the system. So let me turn back to the trade people before I go again to Reza and to the macro. Now, you know, Kate, you're right. I think you made very good points about the EU. You know, where does the EU stand here? It's not just between the US and China, and then one can discuss, is it closer to one, is it closer to the other one? And obviously the EU, which is an economy of the same size roughly as the US and China, is get to be also autonomous in its capacity to shape the system, not just in reaction and not just position itself between the two others. At the same time, it's clear that those three actors, the US, China, and the EU, are the ones that have the most systemic impact, right? So where those actors will shape the system is where the system will go in the coming years. So that's what I want to take you all a little bit to. You know, I'm personally not, you know, to put my cards on the table, and maybe also because I'm a bit older than the other panelists here. When I look at this US-China, it's more than a dispute by this time. It's basically a war. It does remind me, obviously, of an earlier episode, US-Japan. But I think there is a huge difference between US-Japan. You know, US-Japan was pretty fierce. I mean, I lived in the US at the time, and I mean, it was Japan every day, just like it's now China every day in the news in the US. Then it was Japan, and but I think there is and in a sense, the US-Japan was resolved through different mechanisms, including bilateral discussions. Obviously, the geopolitical relationship between the US and Japan is and was, at the time of the fights, very different from the geopolitical relationship between the US and China. War and troops and all of those kind of issues. So I'm personally not one who believes, and I would like to hear a little bit from the panel members, including from a US perspective, from a Chinese perspective, and then from a European perspective. I'm not one who believes, just to put my cards on the table, that bilateral discussion between the US and China will resolve the problem. It's just not there. So it may solve some very short-term issues. Sure, there are elections coming in the US, and there are all kinds of things that one needs to get over. But I think the matter that has been put forward, not only by this US president, but what one hears quite a lot in the US, shared quite broadly, is that yes, there is a bigger issue here between the US and China that's simply short-term. And as I said, I don't think that this can be resolved bilaterally. And it seems to me that the only way one can resolve, and this is where I think that Europe is indeed a huge role to play with these like-minded countries, is through the WTO, through the multilateral route. So I would like to hear from the different panelists what they think. Do they believe that there is a bilateral solution to the problems, or that it's not possible? And if it's not possible, will it be possible to have a multilateral solution? Or is that not possible either? And where are we? Let me start with you, Bernd, on this.
Of course, I'm also convinced that the stabilization of the trading system is only possible in the multilateral way. And therefore, the clear point of the European side, the Commission and the Parliament, that we stick to the rule of WTO in all our action we do. We will have the problem with the appellate body. In December, you mentioned it. So we rejected any proposal to go out of the system and create some alternative. We stick to the system and we are trying to find a solution in the system. And yes, the upcoming problems, and yeah, you're right, we have some similar interests. The question of protection of IPR, no doubt about, or the question of state-owned enterprises. But this we want to solve inside the WTO. We created some possibilities with like-minded countries to go ahead with these problems inside the WTO. And I hope a lot of further countries will join. You mentioned the e-commerce, the IPI, the trade, the investment facilitation system. So there are moments where we are going ahead, and indeed, specifically on the e-commerce, I see also a bridge-building function, because it's not like in several other negotiations inside the WTO that we have the really important Western countries and the suffering southern countries. We have a really bridge function with e-commerce. So there are some perspectives inside WTO, but this requires, of course, that everybody, the 164 members of WTO, will go ahead in the same line. And this is a little bit complicated. For example, the appellate body, we are waiting still for some proposals to reform the model so that everybody can stick to this two-stage approaches for an independent appellate body. And this is necessary. And there we need really a lot of talks, a lot of perhaps G20 and G7 action, that everybody is on board. But indeed, a solution for the problem, specifically regarding the global value chain, 70% are based, of trade are based on global value chains, are not possible to solve in a bilateral way.
Kate, let's go down this way. Yeah, Kate.
Well, it may surprise you, but the United States does believe the WTO has a really important role to play in these discussions. And frankly,
I'm not surprised.
Frankly,
nothing surprises me at this stage, by the way.
You know, frankly, you described our former adversary, Japan, which now is a very strong ally in our work in the WTO with the EU to try to address many of these issues in a more systemic fashion. We think that's important. In the rollout of our Section 301 investigation against the problems that we saw in China on forced technology transfer, joint venture requirements, cyber theft, et cetera, one outcome of that was a WTO case. We do believe in the system. We want to use the system. And I'll remind you as well, I mean, you noted in your comments that when China joined in 2001, it was a monumental change in the WTO. And we supported China joining the WTO at that time because we saw a trajectory which brought China in line with the system that we in the EU were founding members of. Over time, of course, that has not come to pass. We have now stated publicly that Chinese policies now are so at odds with the policies of the market-based trading system that perhaps it was a mistake in 2001 to have allowed them in. And we need to address that problem. So a multilateral discussion or a trilateral discussion, which I'll remind you, our ministers have met 7 times in the past 2 years on this very issue, which demonstrates a strong commitment to the multilateral trading system. But we are a bit clear-eyed, perhaps, about the shorter-term prospects there. Dialogue is important. Multilateral dialogue is very important. But when we talk to China or when we see the past decade of interaction with the Chinese government at presidential levels, we see the same commitments made over and over again, but no follow-through. And when we have reports that detail $50 billion in annual losses to American intellectual property, to say, well, let's negotiate an agreement in the WTO where we don't have much success, and we can talk about things like fish, which we should be able to get to an agreement on, but we can't for other fundamental problems at the WTO. We have to take action to defend our interests, and that's what you see this administration doing. Not turning its back to the multilateral system, but recognizing that there are limitations to what the multilateral system can do at this point, and so therefore having to defend our interests.
Yi?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for asking a lot of good questions. Let me come in from a very narrow-minded academic perspective, because we look at the things from one hand, left-hand side, right-hand side, and invisible hand. So let me start it. Number one, WTO, we mentioned about a lot, sorry, it's a bad joke. So WTO already started 2001. It's already past 18 years. US-Japan conflicts it's happened a long time ago. Time is different. Let me precisely mention two things. Number one, in terms of technology change, I just mentioned what's the benefit, what's the cost of a trade opening, trade integrations. One thing most people coming from competition side, but another thing about technology improvement. For example, the cost, the benefit may be the price CPI decline because of a lot of cheap goods from China. But on the other hand, what happened to the technology? If there was a job loss, it might be in the future, like looking forward, it's a robot is replace a job. Good job replace bad job. It's evidence not from China. Look at a recent paper by Stanford Professor Nick Blom, and my recent work used Korean data, so-called trading with benefit. By trading, a lot of technology improvement to push, because China joined WTO, to push European firms upgrade to more innovations, upgrade the supply chain, upgrade the technologies, integrate, reduce costs. A lot of endogenous change in terms of technology movement. That's why cost the benefit from trade side. Another thing coming from technology. Secondly, WTO. So recent AER paper, academic paper tried to argue. So more benefit for China join WTO, not only for export to US, more importantly, it's internal opening. Reduce a lot of distortion historically for land, the credit, everything. And we pay the cost. Environment. So there's no free lunch. It's a benefit and a cost. Finally, I think very important, as Alicia mentioned, very important. We look at externally, current account, capital account, it's saving minus investment. We're living in an environment, long-term return for capital is lower. And nowadays, if you think about deeper about US-China conflict, two major big trading partners have big issues. What happened to the equity market? What happened to commodity market? What happened to the fundamental for international trading, international monetary system? It's FX market. And what's the rule for euro? A lot of important issues of safe asset. I believe there's a lot of way to use very careful academic research to looking forward, follow the current research. But last but not least, I live in Geneva. My office in my left-hand side is WTO, right-hand side is WIPO's. So we cannot ask WTO to do everything. WIPO, International Intellectual Property Organization, they do a lot of research. And recently, one final conclusions in terms of Chinese R&D, Chinese firm patent, not only patent per se, the number, also patent citation, patent qualities. Foreigner side of Chinese patents, majorly coming not from Chinese SOE, it's coming a lot of Chinese private firms. So let's look at data, let's look at academic research, then we have a better understanding about what's going on and looking forward. Thank you.
Thanks. Alicia, you are based in Hong Kong, as was said in the previous session. You are also a macroeconomist, and you are very, very keen, and you have been for quite a while, a very, very keen observer of the Chinese economy, and also of the Chinese economic and political system. So, what would be your estimate, your bet, as to where this dispute, this trade war between China and the US is going? You think that there is a possibility of a bilateral solution, a fix, a solution, or you think that would be very hard? And do you think that there is a possibility of a multilateral solution to this, or no solution, or sort of something that is going to continue, and then we will come back to Reza to tell us what are the consequences of this.
Thanks very much. Well, I guess the first thing I would have to say is that for the trade war to be solved multilaterally, we would have to be invited to the table. So first I have to start by saying this, that I just can't accept in a way as a European the argument that, we're all in for the WTO. So just a direct response to what I heard. I mean, I heard the direct response to our memo. Now I'm going back to you as a direct response to your comments. For this to be a multilateral solution, we need to be at the table. And if we aren't, which is the case today, there is a high price to pay for Europe. That's why we are asking to be at the table. And the price is very simple, because as happened with Japan, very same thing, which happened, unfortunately, for Japan, is that when there are two at the table and one happens to be the hegemon, the conditions tend not to be, I wouldn't say fair, but close to that. And what I mean is that if you look at the semiconductor industry in Japan at the time and what happened to that industry, if you look at the forced or imposed imports of autos at the time from the US into Japan, if you look at the Plaza Accord, if you look at the deflationary pressures in Japan since and the collapse of a bubble, I don't think they're all unrelated to that solution. So what I'm trying to say is that by making it multilateral, I think the solution can be fair or more like agreed upon, and probably is even easier for China to accept, because in a way, there's no way to get around it. There's no way to get around it. There's no way to come to Merkel and say, we want a bilateral investment agreement with Europe. We want, there's no way for China to gain time for something that I actually think, and this is from the bottom of my heart, actually loving China very much, what China really needs. China needs to get out of that model for its own sake and for its own benefit down the road. And that model meaning everything that the US and probably Europe doesn't like about the way things work, including a no market economy status, and which frankly, probably China, would, at least part of the leadership would understand that is leading China nowhere in the long run. The return on assets is increasingly low. There is excess capacity. Maybe we solved it in some sectors. It's appearing in others, the auto industry being one, by the way, and that's important for Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in a way, it's beneficial for everybody. First of all, the US, in a way, because by forcing China, the only thing that I think, the US is going to achieve is making China retrench to a model that is not good for China or the world. And that's why I'm calling for a multilateral solution.
Now, Reza, you have heard the trade side of this. This trade war between the US and China, the strong European preference for multilateral solution. I think both in the interest, of the EU and interests, sort of also of, let's say, a vision, a political vision of value, a vision of this issue. What do you make out of what you have heard, and can you add some of the things that you didn't have the time before, but in the light of what you just heard?
Let me just address your question directly and from Europe's perspective. I think obviously, having spent most of my life in a multilateral world, I have to support a multilateral world. But two observations. Number one, even in a multilateral system, bilateral discussions are important. Look at any time there is a move in Europe on any integration or joint initiative, it does start with a Franco-German proposal. It then gets evolved. So I think it is part of the reality of multilateralism that the larger players need to have bilateral consultations. So that's observation number one. Observation number two, from a macroeconomic point of view. Suppose Europe is at the table, and the narrative is, well, Europe is not part of the trade dispute right now, and actually wants to avoid it. but what is it that Europe will bring to the table in a multilateral system? And again, I go back and look at it from a macro point of view. Europe has a very large, persistent trade surplus, which, in fact, by some measures, is larger than China. The question that Europe needs to ask itself and put on the table is, how are they going to address that? And what that large and persistent surplus means is that from a macroeconomic point of view, the policy mix in Europe is not working. It's not working domestically or internationally. So, fine, I think definitely a multilateral dialogue helps, but what is it that you in Europe will put on the table in order to address that huge problem?
Fair, very fair, a very fair point. So let me now open the floor for discussion. Are there some microphones? Yes. Okay. So I'll take first 3 questions. One here in front. Just one here in front first.
Hi, Chen Weihua, China Daily. I have a question for Alicia, maybe other panel who want to comment. It's actually happening today. Chancellor Merkel is going to China. So we all know she is a close friend of the new commissioner, and some call her a mentor even. So do you think her trip is going to reflect the EU new commissioner's future maybe policy on China? What you would think, or what do you think Chancellor Merkel should and would talk to the Chinese leaders on issues, and especially you said working together with China to address the issues, you know. And actually very interesting, I'm interested in talking about the working together, because there was another talk about the working against China. And actually when President Trump tweeted 15 hours ago, he said people asked him to get together with the EU, others to go after China trade practice. He said, no, EU trade is just as unfair, or something like that. Thank you.
And a second question there.
Actually, he helped me to the question, the similar question, but I will read it. The President Trump's Twitter to you all is interesting, because for all of the genius out there, many who have been in other administrations and taken to the cleaners by China, they want me to get together with the EU and others to go after China trade practices. Remember, the EU and all trade us very unfairly on trade also will change. And the president said on numerous occasions that EU is worse than China. So my question goes to Kate from USTR. Do you agree with your president on this particular point?
There's a question here in front.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My question is also similar to what other people have made in terms of multilateral trade negotiation or bilateral. And on a recent visit to China, I was quite surprised to hear both state-owned enterprise and private companies also posing that question, asking, what is Europe's position? Will Europe go on the side of China, or will they go on the side of the US? So I think this trilateral is something that is also being asked for internally. Thank you.
Okay, let me turn to the panel. I'm not asking you, Kate, to take this first. I would like first the Europeans to respond to some of those remarks. So, Bernd, what is your?
Of course, we have competition even with China and with the United States as well. So the world has changed, no doubt about, and this is a reality, and we have to react on that. And this means indeed that we are really trying to involve the partners in dialogue and in negotiations. Well, this is the only possibility to stabilize, and this is also a give and take. No doubt about it, and you're quite right. Our surplus in goods is a problem, and we have to act and give something to our trading partner to find a solution. But regarding China, of course, we have also the question of give and take. So perhaps the question of investment is a question we are negotiating with China, and there's a round coming soon, and there's some progress. This means on the other side, of course, that we have also to talk to China about state-owned enterprise, and I'm not sure that private companies in China are really private, to be honest. And the question of protection of IPR. So there is a give and take to convince the partners which are in competition to respect the ruling. But this means give and take. And yes, I think Chancellor Merkel will also mention some of these elements, so that if China is playing a fair role in the international system, international rules have to be accepted. And of course, the best way to introduce them and to implement them is on a multilateral way.
Well, first, the answer is yes, of course I agree with my boss. Second, I mean, you can imagine I wake up many mornings with new tweets, and unfortunately the format of the tweeting, despite the fact that Twitter graciously expanded the content requirements, still make it difficult for me to comment on the nuance or perhaps the environment in which he delivered that tweet. So I'll speak a little bit more generally about what the president has said on multiple occasions, and frankly is not new to this administration. It's simply that Twitter has changed the way in which these messages are delivered. Of course, we have concerns with barriers that our products face in Europe. We have been trying to address them through lots of different ways. We see them in WTO disputes, of course, a very prominent one about to reach its conclusion after 15 years, which is another discussion about WTO dispute settlement we should talk about. We try to do it through bilateral methods. We have, over time, tried many, many times to negotiate understandings between us, whether it's in the form of a broad free trade negotiation. My former hat was associate chief negotiator on TTIP, so I have some experience with that. Certainly under this administration, we've looked at more targeted regulatory discussions as an attempt to address some of these persistent regulatory and other non-tariff barriers. So the president is simply conveying something that we hear from our companies and our stakeholders all the time about barriers our products face in Europe. We want to do away with those. That continues to be a goal of this administration. It was in the president's first trade policy agenda just after he took office that negotiations with Europe continue to be in the best interest of the United States. So,
let me add a question, and that relates to the last point that you made, Reza, which is obviously a good point. That, you know, however we do wish to privilege a multilateral framework, that doesn't mean that bilateral discussions are not helpful, are not conducive to those broader discussions. So they should not be viewed as a substitute, right? They're complements. That is certainly a good point. Now, I mean, what we hear, right? I mean, this is the EU position. The EU position is that has been stated on many occasions by the Commission, by the Commissioner, by different heads of states. The EU position in this China-US fight is that yes, we share a lot of things with the United States as far as state-owned enterprises are concerned, as far as IPR is concerned. So on the substance of some of the complaints that the US has vis-à-vis China, we are very much on the same in the same situation. We share that. On the other hand, we do not share the U.S. approach, which we regard as unilateral and not conducive to bring about a solution to a real problem. Right? This is the EU position. Sounds to me personally a good position. I share that position. Then the question is, how do you translate that position into actual action? Okay, so are you a bystander saying, well, 1 point for you and 1 point for you, or -1 for you and -1 for the other, and then you keep watching the game, or are you engaging in a different manner? Now, question to all of the panelists, and concrete question. We are engaged in principle. Kate, you spoke about TTIP in a previous life, but in the current life, there is, in principle, some kind of framework for a bilateral negotiation with the US. I remember that Parliament has some hesitation about that, but in principle we have that, but nothing is going on, right? And equally with China, we, the EU, we have for several years a negotiation on investment. And the investment negotiation tackles some of those issues here. So do you think that those bilateral discussions with the US on the one hand and with China on the other, with the US on trade, with China on investment, can be part of the EU contribution, or is that not going anywhere? So let me just Reza, here, please take
deprive you of the chair's privilege. From a macro point of view, I think one needs to go much further. The reality is twofold. One, there are these trade tensions which are exacerbating uncertainty, but there are domestic issues in almost each of the major economies which also necessitate policy action. And given the fragility in the global economy right now, there is, of course, a lot of focus on what the Fed would do, given its importance for global markets. But I think there is a need to look beyond trade issues in the short run in Europe. I think those trade tensions exacerbate the pressure, but some of the solutions in terms of dealing with the problem of the uncertainty are here. If uncertainty has gone up, it means what economists call equilibrium. Interest rates are lower now. There is a case for lower interest rates, but more importantly, given the large trade surplus in Europe, I think Europe will be economically and politically in a much stronger position in expressing views on trade if there is fiscal expansion in Europe in order to reduce that trade imbalance. I think it's necessary from a macro point of view. It's necessary in terms of having the moral authority on the trade issues.
Alicia.
Yeah. As a macroeconomist as well, everything is relative. We can, of course, do more fiscal. Others could do less. That would help their current account deficit. Because it's just, having a surplus is a reflection of a deficit somewhere else. And we could also analyze why others have a deficit. We don't only need to analyze why we have a surplus. And I just think, frankly, that US saving ratio is extremely low. Ours is between China and the US. Meaning, we could argue we have a problem, but certainly the extremes may have more of a problem. So when I see that, I just think that if I had that level of savings, I wouldn't do a fiscal stimulus. We could do one, certainly, but the point is the relative stimulus. And where we are now is that, in my humble opinion, the country who didn't need a stimulus did it. Those, Europe, we needed it, we didn't do it. But it's not only Europe. We Europeans I don't know whether we feel victims, but I can assure you, as a European living very far, I always feel that we always blame everything on ourselves. But actually, we are in the middle in the saving ratio. And I need to answer the question because, the bilateral investment agreement, will Merkel go and say, yes, fine with me, maybe, but this is a European level bilateral investment agreement. And I've seen this before in 2014 with Karl de Gucht as a trade commissioner who happened to bring China to the WTO. And there were two concomitant cases, CTE, I remember, and solar panels, and there you go, Xi Jinping, who had just come to power, kindly visited Madame Merkel, President Merkel, and so basically I hope that this is decided at the European level, because that's the whole point. The whole point is to have a bilateral investment agreement that makes sense for all and that we are very comfortable with, because there's a lot of thorny issues there, one being, of course, the role of state-owned companies, which relate, as Andrew was saying, to a potential reform for WTO. So in other words, if we get that right, that could be a model on the multilateral setting to deal with that specific issue, which is very important both for Europe and the US. So in that regard, I hope that we don't water down our expectations by bilateral agreements. I understand bilateral discussions are important if they stop at discussions, but they don't basically go beyond the discussion to a decision level, which should lie at the European Commission at this point in time.
Yeah.
So I'm a professor in economics, so I will focus on academic research in terms of trade and outside trade. Number one, I'll give you an example. Global value chain matters, not bilateral, multinational. Think about Airbus. Also, European very proud of. Every part of a machine, part of an instrument coming from France, Germany, China, Russia, every single world. US, of course, as well. So it's very hard to differentiate the end. Once we leave globalization 2.0, follow global value chain, number one. Number two, a lot of things outside the trade, more important, which currency trade is based on. I just come back ECB, very important, the rule of euro. Euro as international currency in terms of goods trade. For example, I'm a big fan of Barolo. Previously, I have to buy in dollar terms. Now, because US-China says the price goes up, I can buy. I use a euro. Very simple. Euro as international currency. So we've got a benefit of getting involved in international monetary systems. It's a trade. It's important. We look at trade. And more important, behind the trade, under globalization 2.0. Thank you.
Kate, please.
Maybe
the bilaterals.
Yeah, maybe to just also pick up on a point that you raised, which is that we do hear from the EU and member state representatives that they share our diagnosis of the problem with China, but not perhaps the approach in which we are undertaking the issue. And I think that's fine. I would prefer probably that the talking point be they share the diagnosis, but they have different tools to employ. We have different tools as governments. Of course, in the United States, we have much more unilateral authority. The European Union system and the relationship with the various member states and their relationships with China, it's a bit more complex. But our view, of course, is that we should employ tools that we have, or perhaps that new commission officials may be contemplating to address this problem. And frankly, bilateral interaction with the Chinese is something that we both have been doing for a long period of time. Of course, we were negotiating a bilateral investment treaty for a very long time on many of the issues which came out in the Section 301 report. And regrettably, we did not feel that we were progressing in a way beneficial to our interests. And frankly, we communicated with the European Union throughout that process in ways to share information and to learn from each other. And so certainly the idea that you would sever bilateral engagement with China is not appropriate. And the idea remains that a China which fulfills the commitments it made to the WTO in 2001 and becomes a mature and fair trading partner remains our interest. Structural reform remains our interest, and we would like to use the tools that we have. We would like other trading partners to use the tools they have to get us to that point.
Of course, bilateral talks are helpful, specifically with the big elephants. But of course, everything has to be put on the table. You mentioned the surplus with goods. The United States had the surplus in services, capital flow, investment, transfer from profit. So everything has to be put on the table in bilateral talks. But of course, sometimes it's a little bit complicated to talk, and you mentioned the problem with the mandate we had in the parliament. If there is a continuous threat, we have the threat from the United States on steel tariffs, we have the threat not to have an understanding in Boeing Airbus case, no negotiations at the moment about a solution for that. We have the threat with Spanish olives, we have this threat with cars and car pass. So a little bit complicated to talk under threat. But nevertheless, of course, we are trying, and this is the goal, no doubt about, to have both under the tent, China and the United States. And of course, bilateral talks are helpful, and even we have the threat, it's necessary to talk. But sometimes it's also necessary to have a forum where these big elephants are not in the room. So we created this Ottawa forum where some like-minded countries, by the way, also some countries from the developing world, on the table to try to facilitate for this goal everybody in the tent.
Excellent. We can take 2 or 3 more questions. You go ahead. You go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Can you please introduce yourself?
I'm Mr. Barouti. I'm Senior Research Fellow within Research et Documentation Juridique Africaine. As you can easily realize, I'm a lawyer, an academic lawyer. I don't have a question, but I want to comment on the topic of trade. The first is that I confirm that even on multilateral dialogue, there is bilateral possibilities. True, but it depends the way the big elephants are using the bilateral relationship, because if there is problem, most of the time China starts to treat all the countries, developing countries who have a bilateral relationship with China, to treat them that you should adjust your position to mine, otherwise I suspend a cooperation. That is the bad way to use bilateral relationship. The second point is about multilateralism itself. I agree that dialogue is possible, but we should give a time for the implementation. It's not possible. We should make sure that after 5 or 10 years, one country came and say, I withdraw, I decide to withdraw what, what I agree before during this session. That is, we should avoid, and it's a point to put in the next year United Nations summit on the multilateralism. Most of the time, USA and China threat to withdraw from some convention is no good. Thank you.
Can you just give the microphone next to you? Yes.
Hi, my name is Alan Beattie and I write for the Financial Times. I have a question about trade and the environment, which seems to be likely to be a big theme in the EU over the next few years. When you talk about a carbon border tax, a much greener parliament and so forth. A question is, and threats indeed to deals like Mercosur because of the Amazon. My question is, to what extent is it feasible actually to use trade policy in the EU or elsewhere to export values or to export environmental rules, or will it simply load up trade policy to the point where it's actually just impossible to execute it?
Very good question. Just one last question here in the front. George.
Thank you very much. George Sapari, National Bank of Hungary. I wanted to bring in 2 questions that are, I think, is relevant but hasn't been discussed. One is trade diversion. We are, President Trump wants the car producers or some other producers to go back to the United States. Some of them go to Vietnam, Malaysia. From Mexico, automakers are now looking for coming to Central and Eastern Europe. So what you achieve is maybe reducing the current account surplus of China, but not bringing back the jobs to the United States. So that's one question, if you have a reaction to that. And the second is you have to bring in the role of the US dollar. Now that trade is being used by the United States for geopolitical purposes as well, and it gives the exorbitant privilege to the United States, the dollar, within Europe, it has increased the thought that maybe the euro should be playing a bigger role. Now, of course, it will take a long time before that will happen. But again, the problem is that this trade war has actually started thinking and started movements in many, many other directions. That's my point. But if you have any reaction to that.
Thank you. So I'm going to give now just about a minute to each panelist to pick whatever he or she wishes to, but I can't resist, again starting from this direction, I can't resist, Bernd, to ask you, or to repeat in a sense the question from Alan Beatty on the carbon, the border carbon tax. The new president of the Commission has put the Green Deal at the top of her agenda. And we heard when she made a speech at the European Parliament that she did detail essentially a strategy. It was not just a Green Deal. She gave a number of details. And in those details, there was indeed the proposal to put forward legislation, I suppose, for carbon, border carbon tax. Do you have a reaction to that?
Alan, we just discussed the other part of the question several times. These are not European values. The question of the Paris Climate Agreement is a universal value, or the ILO convention are universal conventions. So we are sticking to the universal perspective of mankind. And this is really important, that this is respected by trade agreements. And one of the elements is indeed the Paris Climate Agreement, and we have to reflect how we can have a dialogue with our partners in respecting the commitments made in Paris. And one measure could be some border measurements. I'm not sure that tax will be the end of the day. We will examine now the different proposals. First, it's clear, and this is also related to our discussion, it has to be WTO compatible. That's the first criteria which has to be fulfilled. Secondly, it's also the question what will happen if some products, some member state, some partners will have better CO2 performance than the European Union. Will they get some money from the European Union too? So there are a lot of questions to discuss. We will do it really seriously and will come up with a proposal, and then of course the European Parliament will optimize the proposal as usual.
Kate, whichever point you want to take.
Sure, maybe in the same veins. I mean, you know, of course, the United States has placed a very high value on environmental and labor standards in its FTAs. And, you know, in some ways, our FTA commitments, certainly post-2007, when our Congress issued new guidance on the inclusion of these types of proposals, the US FTA model is arguably the strongest in terms of enforcement and in compelling our trading partners to actually take on board the commitments they make to us in our FTAs. And we back that up by the possibility of trade sanctions on par with the rest of our agreement. And that's something that we believe has worked. There's a lot of evidence of our discussions, particularly with countries in Latin America, in terms of these very issues. Now, what is important, I think, to understand, and this is relevant to a Democrat administration, one that supports the Paris Climate Agreement and perhaps one that doesn't, is that our Congress, which ultimately gives us the authority to negotiate trade agreements, has been quite explicit on this point, and including lots of geopolitical and geostrategic interests, whether or not they are interests of the US Congress or not. There is a very strong commitment in our Trade Promotion Authority that there has to be a direct relationship to trade flows. And so for that reason, the Congress has found repeatedly that including very broad treaty mandates into a trade negotiation is not going to be something that the Congress supports, and that drives the way that we look at these issues from a trade perspective.
Let me start with the last question about international currency. My recent work with Richard Portes and Lange, we try to find out, so euro and RMB or another international currency have some benefit. Number one, reduce the transaction cost for trading. Number one. Number two, more importantly, we look at whole Euro area, saving money's investment. Once euro becomes international currency, the funding costs decline dramatically. So it's promoting for investment as well. So the role of a euro as an international currency have a very bright future, and have a lot of academia policy discussion for that. Secondly, about environment, I do have one paper. We try to understand why Chinese firm responds to regulation for environment. We do find out from change technologies, the increase TFP, to increase performance after the environment regulations, which more tough regulation for the environment. The firm can respond. We cannot, a lot of research try to look at saving money's investment. Very simple countries, the country I live, Switzerland, saving money minus investment is higher than China right now. Because after global financial crisis, the China growth, if you go to China, there's a new phenomenon. It's consumptions, e-commerce, fintech lendings, household debt. So a lot of new issues, new phenomena deserve very careful, serious research, and maybe next time I can present an academic paper here. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I take from here and I answer your Sabari's question. Yes, saving minus investment higher in Europe and Switzerland, but the level is lower, meaning your level of saving, your level of investment is still too high. And thus your return on assets is too low. And thus your overcapacity is not ending. And thus we still have problems, especially right here and in Europe. So it's not only about the difference, it's about the level that creates issues. And I actually think that by lowering that level, which would lower your growth rate, unfortunately, which seems to be the one and only target, would actually be a good thing for China and the world, because you would indeed, maybe with some bumps in your growth rate, but towards a more consumer consumption-based growth model. So that's what I'm saying. That and by the way, it's not only Europe or Switzerland. Japan, Taiwan, Korea have large current account surpluses. And by the way, maybe structurally, some countries are more productive than others. Maybe we have to live with that idea. And going back to that, I agree. Trade war won't solve the US trade deficit. I'm sorry. Because that surplus may move from China to Vietnam to Taiwan to, you need to solve it at home, because it's not only due to distortions. You just have to look at it. It's due to many other things. Part of that may be due to distortions. Let's solve those problems, but it may appear somewhere else. China's, the transfer of the value chain away from China started well before the trade war. And it's very simple. Wages are too high for some products. The value chain in China is becoming more integrated and higher value added, so whatever is below a certain level is being pushed elsewhere, not only from Europe or the US, but also from China. So that's the new world. I mean, there will always be a place cheaper than you. I mean, that's the reality. So there will always be places where something can be produced, and you can't solve that with tariffs. It's just not possible. Move up and try to produce stuff that others can't do. That's a much better idea, I feel. Yeah.
That's what my old professor Bella Balassa called the ladder of comparative advantage. Sure. Always moving along the ladder. Reza, the last points are for you.
I think I agreed with a lot of what has just been said, particularly by Alicia, but 2 points. First, on international role of the dollar and any substitute. I think it is unrealistic to think of RMB until you have an open capital account in China. You need to be able to invest in China and for Chinese citizens to invest abroad in order to have any notion of an internationalization in a major way. In terms of the euro, obviously, euro does have that quality, but I give you just one statistics. What you do need is a large depth in the financial markets, which, of course, with Brexit, it is damaged in Europe. Just give you one statistics. The daily turnover in the treasury market in the US is 600 billion. The safest assets in Europe, German bonds, the daily turnover is less than 20. So that doesn't give you a depth of the market in order to hold that as an international reserve currency that would be dominant. So there's a long way to go. There is good work being done, particularly by Bruegel. My final word, I think the global economy and the global financial markets are in a fragile, and the degree of uncertainty is very high. And it does not usually take one single event to tip it into a difficult situation or a more difficult situation, but the trade disputes at this point in time definitely have that potential.
So we are coming to a conclusion of this panel. I'd like to thank all of the panelists. I think it was great to have both the trade perspective and the discussion about the usual trade wonk kind of matters, but to put that also in a macroeconomic perspective, which I think is very much needed at the time, as for the reasons that have been indicated. So wish you a good lunch, and thank you to all the panelists.